Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the issues and ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. We are living, as we all know, in consequential times. During the Constitutional Convention, James Madison said, "The means of defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home." Madison's wisdom is being displayed and tested at this moment. As we all know, President Donald Trump, with great gusto, has begun to deploy troops, whether active duty troops or federalizing the National Guard, to cities all over the country. Portland, Los Angeles, Chicago, threatening many other places. And in doing this, he has burst through longstanding practices, burst through laws, upended perhaps the constitutional expectation and order, and much more, and heightened tension in places all over the country. It's a big issue for all of us who care about the rule of law. It's a big issue for all of us who care about the proper relationship between civilian government, the public, and the military. And it calls on all kinds of questions that have really been big all throughout American history, but a lot of them have been dormant for a long time. We are very fortunate to have two of the country's leading experts on this topic to educate us, to talk through some of the nuances, to answer your questions, which you're encouraged to send in. I'm joined here by my colleague, Liza Goitein. She is one of the country's leading experts on presidential power and emergency power. She's the senior director of the Liberty and National Security Program here at the Brennan Center for Justice, and a longtime colleague of mine. And thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
In your first in-person opportunity to be in our new studio. And we are very lucky to be joined by General William Enyart. He was a United States congressman representing Southern Illinois, and before that had a 36-year military career, culminating in his time as the Adjutant General of the National Guard of Illinois, with all that entailed, including coordinating the biggest deployment of the National Guard outside the country to Afghanistan since World War II, and understanding what the National Guard is, what its role is, why it's got a very particular and important role in our constitutional system, and why that is being put at risk, is something that we're really excited to have his insight on today. And I'll start with you, General. What is unusual about what is happening right now? The National Guard has been used in other settings. The military has been used domestically in other settings at times. What's unusual and what's of concern about this right now?
Well, the big concern here is that the administration, that President Trump has federalized these National Guard troops and sent them in against the express wishes of both the local authorities and of the governor of the states in question. That virtually never happens. We have really well-established protocols on how the National Guard is used in the event of civil disturbances. They've been in place for a long time. They work quite well. And President Trump has chosen to disregard those protocols and override them in every instance here. And the courts have been slapping his hands for this misuse of federal power.
And we're going to have a chance to really unpeel all the layers there, because as you say, this is a federalization of a state military force under the law and under the Constitution, but with huge implications for power and people's rights and the shape of our government. And we'll want to really understand that. And Liza, you can help us out to give us a broad overview to start out with. What is the legal justification for this? How does this happen? How is it that a president can do this?
Right. So any conversation about domestic deployment of the military has to start with the Posse Comitatus Act. That is the law that normally prevents the use of federal armed forces, including
we
federalized.
Usually prohibit Latin, but in this instance,
yeah, I mean, we could call it PCA. That's even worse. It's an acronym. But this is, it's not just a law. It's not just Latin. It is such a powerful norm that we have had in this country for centuries, since the founding. And it is a prohibition against using federal forces, including federalized National Guard forces, to engage in law enforcement activities inside the United States. And that includes quelling civil unrest. Now, there are exceptions. There are statutory exceptions that Congress has passed. And those are meant and designed for the most extreme circumstances. And so historically, they've been used very rarely. And what we're seeing now, as General Enyart explained or started to describe, is really just historically just completely beyond the pale for anything we've seen presidents do before, in the sense that he's using troops against the wishes of governors and state authorities in situations where state and local authorities have the situation in hand, where you don't have this kind of out of control violence or civil unrest that historically, when that has happened, the governors have asked for help because they know things are out of control. And here it's the opposite.
And as you know, I wrote a book about the history and the roots of the Second Amendment, and the fear of having what they call the standing army, the fear of centralized military power, was very much on the minds of the founders, certainly on the minds of the people as they ratified the Constitution. It was actually one of the reasons they wrote the Second Amendment, to give more power, to preserve the power of states to avoid just that kind of military centralization. It was one of the reasons they had the revolution in the first place.
And the Third Amendment and the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, all of these provisions of the Constitution and others that are part of the structural aspects of the Constitution were designed to ensure that you didn't have the military become an instrument of tyranny. So this is baked into our country's founding. The misuse of the military, of troops to suppress the rights of the colonists by King George III was one of the primary grievances in the Declaration of Independence. So this was absolutely very much on the minds of the framers. It's why the Constitution is drafted the way it is. It's why we have the rights that we have. And later, it became enshrined into statute in this Posse Comitatus Act, which, I'm sorry, it's Latin. I don't know what else to call it.
We'll allow it.
So this is just, it's in our country's DNA. And in that respect, what's happening right now is just profoundly un-American. It goes against traditions, values, and norms that have gone back since the beginning.
But I guess a question that some people might have is, what's so bad about it? In other words, if you're living in a community and there's crime, and it's more crime than there ought to be, or maybe immigration laws need to be enforced, or whatever the reasons are that are being asserted, why does it matter to me if I live there, whether it's a locally controlled police force or state controlled National Guard or a national force? What's so bad about it?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two parts to the answer. And the first part is something that I can speak to. And maybe the second part is something General Enyart can speak to. The first part is the reason we have this principle in the first place is because an army turned inward against the people can very quickly become an instrument of tyranny and oppression. You look at the U.S. military, that is the strongest fighting force in the world, and it is trained to destroy an enemy. If you turn that inward against the people of this country, it can really, it can be I don't want to sound hyperbolic here, but it has profound potential implications and consequences for democracy and for individual liberty. And really, even if the army is not being used, or federalized guard forces, directly to suppress rights, their mere presence on the streets of cities and towns in this country can chill the exercise of rights that we cherish as Americans, the right to sort of move freely in our towns and in our cities, and to speak out, to demonstrate, to peacefully protest. These are rights that are core to who we are as a people. It's core to having a democracy, and having the military permeate our cities in the way that we are starting to see in some cities in this country can really change the tone and change just the feeling of what it means to sort of live in this country.
Thank you for pointing to the General. General, what does the National Guard typically do in a state? And how is what's happening now and what could be happening more, how is it different from that? And what are the implications for the people who sign up for National Guard duty?
Well, the National Guard has two principal roles. The first role, and when you're in the National Guard, you actually have two hats. You have the federal hat and you have the state hat. You can only wear one hat at a time. So as a guardsman, you are also in the Army Reserve. So your rank, whether you're a buck sergeant or a colonel or a general, is the same rank as you would hold on active duty, or the same rank you'd hold in the Army Reserve. Okay. So what are the two different roles that the National Guard perform? Number one is, and that's our federal mission, and that is the defense of this country. So whether we're called to go to Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq, those are federal defense missions, and those are done under Title 10. That's the active duty statute. And so that's our one role. And our other equally important role is to provide a trained, ready force for use by the governor in times of emergency. And so typically those tend to be natural disasters, whether it be hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, forest fires, the list goes on. You know, we've all seen photographs of National Guardsmen rescuing people from helicopters, from floods, and those sorts of things. So those are the two different roles. When you perform the state duty, you're under the command and control of the governor. Sometimes you're paid by the state, sometimes you're paid by the feds, depends on the nature of the emergency, but you are under the command and control of the governor. When you're on federal orders, then you're under command of the president. So I hope that clarifies that a little bit.
It does, and you have spoken quite eloquently about what it means to those Guard members to be able to do that service during a time of national disaster, helping their community members, helping other people in their state. When people sign up for Guard duty, generally speaking, when they're not deployed overseas, what is it that they're mostly doing? And they're in civilian life as well.
Well, that's right. And that's something that's very important to remember. These soldiers and airmen are part-time soldiers and airmen. Most of them, the vast majority of them, better than 90%, are part-timers. And so they have full-time civilian jobs. We have many young people in the National Guard because of the terrific educational benefits that they receive, the GI Bill, and in many states here in Illinois, the state of Illinois provides a 4-year tuition waiver at any public school in the state for guardsmen. So that's a huge, huge benefit for these young people. Well, when they're called away to active duty, they're called away from their jobs. They're called away from their families. They're called away from their education. It's not like when you're on active duty and your full-time position is as a soldier or sailor or Marine airman. So there is a tension there between your civilian life and your military life. And we have to be careful not to abuse that delicate balance, because without the support of families, who after all sacrifice when their guardsman is called active duty, and without the support of the employer, who sacrifices likewise when their employee, a guardsman, is called away to active duty, you know, that employer's got to cover that shift that guardsman would have been working, whether he has to hire someone to come in on a temporary basis, or he has to spread some overtime around, or the job doesn't get done. But those are all critical elements that impact a guardsman's life, career, and education.
And they are, among other things, they are not trained for law enforcement, right? In other words, during your time as adjutant general, did a governor just call up and say, you know, I'm a little worried about the crime rate here or there. Let's throw some National Guard forces in, or does that happen? What are part of the dangerous interaction with the public comes in the context, I think, of what people are being asked to do right now. Are they trained to do law enforcement? Are they trained to do immigration policy?
Well, no, they're not. They're, we do have military police units, but those units are trained to do military police work, not civilian. They're not civilian law enforcement officers. The National Guard is not a civilian law enforcement reserve. It is a military reserve. We are trained in combat skills, so whether it be as a combat engineer or an infantryman or an artilleryman or whatever. Now, some of those skills, of course, can translate to civilian life. A transportation company drives trucks, but we are not trained to do civilian law enforcement. And, that's one of the interesting things about the Trump administration's different claims for needing the National Guard on duty. One, they say, well, crime has overtaken our cities, crime is running rampant in Chicago, and I have to have the Guard to control that crime. Well, then the National Guard is not trained as a civilian law enforcement agency, and it's very expensive to mobilize the Guard. Mm-hmm. The money that's spent on doing that would be better served by training and paying additional police officers. The second argument that he's using is he needs them to protect ICE agents in Chicago, specifically here in Illinois. But the director of the Illinois State Police says, well, we've got this situation well in hand and we don't need the National Guard.
I mean, it seems that all the various shifting rationales, this is to deal with crime, this is because the federal forces are overwhelmed, this is to help with general immigration enforcement. The purpose of sending the troops, it seems to me, is to send the troops to demonstrate increasing impunity in the ability to use troops domestically, even when they're not needed, and to kind of heighten tensions and heighten the drama of it all, because the number of troops that are being used in these various places is not that great. It seems to me that it's as much to kind of burst through the legal walls and that sort of thing as anything else. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think there are many different reasons one could speculate as to why the administration is doing this. But you are correct; they're not calling a whole lot of guardsmen up. A couple of hundred in Chicago and a few hundred in Portland. A couple of thousand in Los Angeles. But I think one of the issues is that this serves as a distraction. What is more exciting to a video crew than National Guardsmen rolling up in Humvees in front of the Washington Monument or rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue in Humvees? That is catnip to media crews. And so it provides a distraction that I think the president sorely needs from the many problems that this administration has, whether it's the collapsing labor market or the tariffs that are impacting the economy, or his failures in negotiating peace as he's claimed he was going to do on day one. So, and we don't even want to begin to bring up the Epstein files now, do we? So I think it serves as a distraction.
No, we wouldn't do that.
I know Governor Pritzker believes that it is designed to accustom people to seeing troops on the street. And I think that's an unfortunate part of this. We don't want to see armed soldiers in our streets. That's a third world situation.
And that is something that really does cut close to what Americans at least are not expecting. It's very often the case that we'll say, "Oh, this isn't our country," but actually, that really isn't something that we have in our country.
No, not historically.
What are the legal justifications being claimed right now?
Yeah.
by the Trump administration for what they're doing?
So in Los Angeles and Portland and Chicago, Trump has relied on an obscure law. It's 10 U.S.C. 12406. I'm sorry, that's even worse than Posse Comitatus Act, but it just doesn't have a catchy title, unfortunately. This is a law that has never been used in the way that Trump is using it, as a standalone authority to quell civil unrest or enforce the law. It authorizes federalization of the National Guard in three circumstances: invasion by a foreign nation, rebellion or danger of rebellion against the U.S. government, or when the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the law. Now, in the past, it was considered to be a call-up authority, a way to get the Guard into federal service so they could then be deployed under separate legal authority. It's now being used on its own, and the claim is that that ICE is unable, the president is unable to enforce immigration law in these cities. Now, what the district courts have all found, and the district courts are the ones that are closest to the facts in the case, is that even if you apply a very deferential standard of review and you give the president a lot of leeway here, that just doesn't match the facts on the ground. We are talking about protests that have been largely peaceful, and that when there have been incidents of violence, state and local authorities have been responding to those incidents and have had the situation under control, or at least under control to the point that ICE was able to execute the law and was able to continue conducting raids, detaining people. That's what the law says. ICE has to be, or the president has to be, unable to execute the law. And that's just not what the facts have shown. But because this law hasn't been used in this way before, there's a lot of unanswered questions about it. What did Congress mean by unable to execute the law? How do you interpret that? How much deference should the president get under this law? We don't really have, again, precedent in the case law for that. Is this law an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, or does it only allow more limited actions by the National Guard? So all of these questions right now are churning through the courts.
And of course, one of the things that's so unusual about this situation is that these National Guard troops are being federalized over the objection of the governor who controls them. And this is not unheard of, but it has been many decades since this has happened. The last time, and we've gone back and forth actually on the facts of this because it's actually muddy at the time. The last time, arguably, was during the Civil Rights era, when George Wallace might or might not have asked for the National Guard to be sent in to protect the marchers from Selma to Montgomery. And I think what happened was he wanted to look like he was being forced, but he also needed the help. But certainly in Little Rock, Arkansas, that was done to, but these were all to enforce.
And in 1962 and 1963 in Ole Miss. So it's during the Civil Rights era, there were numerous incidents where governors were not on board.
All to enforce federal court orders. There was the real color of law, and it was about extending the Constitution into these areas. The other recent times in 1992 in Los Angeles, during the riots and protests after the acquittal in the Rodney King prosecution of the police officers, that was done with the request of the local government authorities. People, I think, have been somewhat surprised to learn that you can do that.
That's the norm.
That you can do it without the
sorry, that's the opposite of the norm. Yes.
And General, when you were in that role, was it ever contemplated that something would happen outside the desire and control of the governor of the state?
No, that was never any kind of scenario that we envisioned or planned for or had to operate under. There were some occasions when we did bring National Guard into a readiness posture. Back when the Bulls, those who are basketball fans may remember the Chicago Bulls three-peated. And when they three-peated, we actually put a couple of hundred National Guardsmen into an armory in Chicago in preparation in case the celebration got out of control. It didn't. They wound up sitting around the armory, eating pizza and drinking Cokes most of the night, and the local authorities were well able to handle it. But it's generally the governor is always, in my experience, the governor's been on board and made the request. When a situation starts to get out of control, the local officials go to the governor. Then the governor exercises the option to bring in whatever forces he believes necessary. Maybe it's state police, maybe it's conservation police, maybe it's bringing in other sheriff departments. So there are a handful of different options that the governor has, and the National Guard is but one of those cards he can play.
And this is also new in a way, and you've mentioned a few times that because it hasn't happened, we don't know what the precise meaning of this language is and what that language is, and the courts have generally stayed out of this kind of stuff. They're generally quite reluctant to police the use of force by presidents. Where does that general hesitancy come from, and what's happening in the courts right now And what can we expect to unfold, in coming months?
Well, again, we're just starting to find out what the level of deference is under the law that President Trump has been using under the Insurrection Act, which is a law that has been used previously when presidents have wanted to deploy troops for law enforcement to quell civil unrest. There is very old precedent dating back to 1827 in which the Supreme Court held that at least in that circumstance, it was up to the president to decide that whether or not there was an emergency that justified the deployment of the military. And so that case law has stood for a general proposition of deference in this area of domestic deployment, although certainly the facts of that case were distinguishable. Since then, however, there have been cases in which the Supreme Court suggested that there would be an exception for situations in which the president acted outside a permitted range of honest judgment, was not acting in good faith, made an obvious mistake, or did something that was manifestly unauthorized by law. And so what the Ninth Circuit, which is the circuit that's the appellate court in the Oregon and Los Angeles cases. Federal appeals court that heard both the Portland case and the Los Angeles case. And the Ninth Circuit said, we have to be very deferential. It said this old case law on the Insurrection Act also applies to this new statute, but that this deference is not absolute. And so the president has to at least have a colorable basis for his determination that the criteria in the statute are met. And what happened in the Seventh Circuit, which is where the Chicago case was, the federal appeals court for the Chicago case, the Seventh Circuit said, okay, but even under an extremely deferential standard, this doesn't qualify. The facts on the ground.
There's no emergency.
Basically. Nothing that can't be handled by state and local authorities.
So this is a circuit split, as they call it, where two different federal appeals courts have reached two different results. And that is actually appropriate for the Supreme Court to take a case like that. And the Supreme Court will be hearing this case. Tell us what has happened already. It's got some action underway, but will there be a big showdown on this, or will this all take place on the shadow docket, as they call it?
So let me first say that in the Ninth Circuit, where the federal appellate court, there have been two panels of the Ninth Circuit that have extended a lot of deference and said that the federalization of the Guard in Los Angeles and Portland was legal. In one of those cases, which is Portland, the Ninth Circuit as a whole, which means all of the judges on the Ninth Circuit, not just the three judges on that panel, voted to rehear that case and basically put a pause on the three-judge panel's order.
It's kind of second-guessing what they did.
Right. So there may be a very different decision coming out of the Ninth Circuit soon. We don't know yet when it comes to Portland. For the Seventh Circuit, where the three-judge panel unanimously upheld or refused to stay the order of the district court, and the district court said, no emergency here. The administration appealed the Seventh Court's decision on an emergency appeal. And that is usually done on this sort of shadow docket where we get these very quick decisions from the Supreme Court, sometimes one sentence, sometimes no explanations at all. It doesn't look like this one is going that way.
Why is that? Because they've been asking for lots of briefs and that sort of thing?
So there was an amicus brief that was filed that raised a whole new issue unfortunately not. It wasn't a completely new issue. The district court in Chicago had actually looked at this issue, but basically something about the meaning of regular forces in the law. It says that the president has to be unable with the regular forces to execute the law. What does that mean? And there's a very strong argument that actually meant that the president needs to have authority to deploy active duty troops. And that has to, for some reason, be insufficient before turning to federalizing the National Guard. That was the argument made in the amicus brief. The Supreme Court asked for further briefing on that argument. There are briefs due today, responses due next Monday. They're clearly giving it very, very serious consideration. And so that is sort of an alternative grounds on which the court could potentially decide that this law was not properly used in this circumstance.
And would that then point, is that a roadmap for using regular forces in these matters?
So the question is, if the Supreme Court says that President Trump can't use the law that he's relying on right now, will he then turn to the Insurrection Act? And if I had to guess, no matter how the Supreme Court ruled, if the Supreme Court rules against the administration in this appeal, it doesn't really matter what the grounds for the ruling are. The next step would be for President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act.
And we'll talk a little bit about the Insurrection Act because it's such a big, looming sort of Damocles over all of this. I think it would be useful for me to understand why that is even worse than the current situation and what that means. General, I want to ask you a question. I get the sense, and I was even out in Chicago last week and got the sense from talking to folks there, they're angry and concerned and troubled by the use of the National Guard. But even more visible is what's going on with ICE and the Border Patrol agents who are doing such aggressive enforcement, grabbing people, interacting with crowds, shooting tear gas into crowds, and all this kind of stuff, all while wearing masks and covering their badges and all the things we're familiar with. And these are not the National Guard forces. And one of the concerns would be, to me, would be that it's always so vitally important to have trust between the military and the civilian population. And conflating all of this seems to me that it could really redound poorly to everybody involved. Do you see a difference in how the National Guard has been operating and doing what it does compared with ICE and compared with CBP?
Well, let me tell you that one of the things that has greatly concerned me and that I've spoken about is the very great likelihood that civilians will not be able to distinguish between these ICE folks and the Border Patrol folks and the National Guard or the active duty for that matter. These guys are out there wearing full battle rattle. They're dressed like soldiers, look like soldiers, smell like soldiers. So people are not going to be able to tell the difference unless you just happen to be able to read that little patch that says CBP or a Border Patrol somewhere. But I think that's a real detriment to the military of this country because people are so upset over the tactics. And it's not just citizens in the street who are upset about this. I mean, the federal judges have been ruling consistently in Chicago that the Border Patrol and these agents, these ICE agents, have been using unlawful tactics, have been far more aggressive than they need to be, tear gassing and assaulting people. So those in doing this while they're dressed like soldiers, that's really not a good vision to have. And in fact, the ICE folks have been so out of bounds that the chief judge in Cook County, that's Chicago's in, the chief judge of Chicago has ruled that they have to stay out of the courthouses because they were coming in, disrupting legal business and seizing people who are simply there trying to take care of their legal business. So I think it's clearly a vast overreach by the federal government here, and people on the ground have every right to be upset when U.S. citizens it's not just immigrants, it's U.S. citizens, journalists, ministers have all been abused and assaulted in these cases.
In the last day, I read that they were ordering clergy not to pray outside the detention center because
you can't make this stuff up.
You can't make this stuff up because it's not like we have a First Amendment that mentions freedom of religion as well as freedom of speech and assembly. And of course, the size of ICE is going to grow and grow and grow. This was in the budget bill over the past summer. It's going to become the third largest military force in the world behind the U.S. Army and the Chinese Army.
So this is one of the reasons, actually, why we haven't seen troops deployed for law enforcement purposes since 1992. Right? It's not just that it sort of conflicts with modern sensibilities, which is true, but it's also the fact that civilian law enforcement agencies have grown so powerful in terms of their capacity, their size, their equipment, the technological sophistication, military-grade equipment that civilian law enforcement agencies have today. There are just very few situations that are going to be beyond their capacity to handle without the military. Now, in Portland, I believe it was, the administration in court said, well, we diverted 115 Federal Protective Service agents, and that's it. Our bandwidth is stretched. We don't have any more that we can possibly divert besides these 115 agents. Well, in fact, there is a law that allows the Secretary of Homeland Security to cross-designate any DHS official as someone who can protect federal property. And there are 80 or 90,000 people who are available for that purpose.
Currently.
And Congress said, look there first. If you need to divert any personnel to help with protecting federal property, this is how you do it. Through these 80 to 90,000 people who are available. I mean, that dwarfs the size of the Oregon National Guard, which is where President Trump has turned. So civilian law enforcement absolutely has the resources and the capacity to handle these relatively small, overwhelmingly peaceful protests.
Because that's the question I wanted to ask. And I don't support this mass deportation, but the federal government under our system has the ability and the right to implement federal law. And what is the argument that they would make as to why they're having a hard time doing it, given the disruptions and how they can't do it without additional protection?
Well, they've mostly pointed to what has happened in terms of incidents that have violent incidents. And they have said, because of these incidents, we have had to divert personnel. That is a significant, burden or significantly impedes our ability to enforce the law. But at the same time they're saying this, DHS issued a press release in Chicago saying that this hasn't slowed us down, none of this has slowed us down, and pointing to the vast increase in arrests and detentions that were happening during this period. So if you actually look at the facts, there is no inability to execute the law by ICE. In fact, it's been quite the opposite in Chicago. Same thing in Los Angeles. There were declarations that the administration submitted that recounted various incidents, and there were incidents of violence that were unacceptable, and they were handled by state and local law enforcement. Arrests were made. In some cases, charges were brought. But there were these lists of things that happened, and the conclusion was we need the military. Well, if you look carefully in those declarations, they don't cite a single ICE raid that had to be postponed or canceled or that was thwarted as a result of these actions. And that has to be the standard under the law. They have to be unable to execute the law using the regular forces.
In general, how do you see this playing out over time? Do you see more and more now that the ground is being tested? Do you see more and more use of the military domestically in this way? And does it matter also, something we've glossed over a little bit, when done legally, the president, the federal government can federalize the National Guard within a state, but it can also, or can it, march those National Guard members into a different state?
Okay, so you're getting into some pretty complex issues here. But first of all, to deal with the first part of the question, I think that Trump is going to continue to push the envelope on this and try to misuse the military to support his various agendas. And we see this happening in the Caribbean with the unlawful sinking of these alleged drug boats. So Trump loves to play with the military. He loves to be smarter than the generals, as he says he is. And so I believe this is going to continue. And even if the Supreme Court, if he gets ruled against by the full Ninth Circuit and gets ruled against by the Seventh Circuit, and it winds up going to the Supreme Court, I think irrespective of what the Supreme Court says, he will try it under another guise, whether it be the Insurrection Act or not. So that I look for this to continue going on unless it reaches the point where there's essentially an insurrection on the part of the National Guard, and they say, no, we're not going to go do this. But that's not going to happen. They're too well trained, they're too well disciplined, and they will follow. See, that's a terrible, terrible thing too. You know, the Guard is caught in a terrible situation where you are required to follow lawful orders, but you're also required to not follow unlawful orders. And so you may have some 19-year-old kid out there debating over, is this a lawful order or not? And that's not a position we really want to put our young soldiers or even old soldiers. We don't want to put soldiers into that position where they're trying to have to figure out whether this is a constitutional order or not, which is another reason why the National Guard should not be on the streets.
Right. And again, its particular role as pulling people from civilian life and to do their service. Allow me to engage in the realm of fantasy here. You were a member of Congress. Shouldn't Congress be doing something about this?
Yes, absolutely. Of course it should. Congress should be doing a lot of things about a lot of things, and we don't see that happening. There's unfortunately such a deadlock in Congress that that's one of the reasons I think that the executive branch keeps asserting more and more control. Yes, Congress needs to revisit the Insurrection Act as well as defining the president's role in terms of use of the National Guard forces.
And this paralysis in Congress is what we've seen in other countries as helping create the way for strongmen to use the military or for military coups or other interventions. Is when government, the democratically accountable branches of government, can't get their act together. That creates the terrain for this kind of abuse of power. And we're seeing it, at least potentially here. The Insurrection Act is, of course, something that you have worked on, and there are other emergency powers laws that you've worked on. And we actually came closer than one might think to winning some change. But what kinds of things should Congress be doing?
Well, for the Insurrection Act, I think Congress should more specifically and narrowly define the criteria for deployment. We haven't really talked about the Insurrection Act yet.
Why is it particularly specific?
Yeah, so the way that at least the Ninth Circuit has interpreted this other law, 12406, they're starting to look pretty similar. But even so, I think the Insurrection Act is a more powerful tool for various reasons. First, it allows the president to deploy active duty armed forces, as well as federalizing the National Guard. Second, the bar for deployment is, at least in some respects, lower. It doesn't require that the president be unable to execute the law. The level of deference arguably is higher under the Insurrection Act, although the Ninth Circuit has basically said it's similar for the two laws. And then finally, the Insurrection Act is widely understood to be an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. I'm very self-conscious now about the Latin.
That's okay.
But the 12406, this other law, it's unclear. That's still being kind of fought out by the courts.
But given all of that,
right?
And don't worry, he's not watching. Why hasn't President Trump used the Insurrection Act already? He wanted to in 2020.
I can only speculate, and I hate to do that. I will say that that question has confused a lot of people. I'll put it that way.
But the night is young.
Yeah, I do think, I would imagine that there is probably a lot of resistance coming from within the Defense Department to using the law in this way. Now, why that is sufficient in this case, why that would be sufficient rather than just firing everybody who disagrees with him, I'm not sure.
But that was what happened. The resistance by Mike Esper and others in the military was why it was not used in the spring of and summer of 2020. What was so interesting about some of these reform efforts was, on the one hand, there was quite a bit of interesting, intriguing bipartisan support. Rand Paul, Mike Lee, not Twitter Mike Lee, real life Mike Lee, and other libertarians or conservatives were part of these efforts on the one hand. And on the other hand, you didn't get a lot of sense of great enthusiasm from the Biden administration to do anything that would curb their own power? Or is that
Well,
that a little cynical on my part?
Well, I would say this. So I think you're talking mostly about reform of the National Emergencies Act, which has a lot of parallels to the Insurrection Act. There were also reform efforts for the Insurrection Act. They didn't go quite as far.
Who are the leaders on the Insurrection Act?
Senator Blumenthal is really
From Connecticut.
Yes, and Representative DeLuzio.
Senator Blumenthal continues to be very outspoken, and Representative DeLuzio, before he was elected from Western Pennsylvania, it's always worth noting, was an attorney here at the Brennan Center.
Yes, we claim him.
Where he,
but the National Emergencies Act is the one that came the furthest. And what I would say, I would not say that the Biden administration didn't show enthusiasm. I'm not saying they did either. What I'm saying is they didn't prioritize it. I think that there were other initiatives that were more important to them, and it was not made a high priority. And without that, it wasn't going to pass. And I think that's unfortunate. I understand why there were other priorities. I understand that there were many important things that had to be done in that administration. And of course, hindsight is always 2020. But certainly at the time, I felt an urgency. And we at the Brennan Center felt an urgency to try to get this done before we were in a situation like the one we're in now.
So I'm looking at the audience questions, and Matt asked the very question that you've already answered, which is what happens if the Insurrection Act is used? Susan asks a question: what strategies are there to stop this kind of deployment, this kind of improper deployment? How do we empower the courts to act? And what can states and cities and counties do? Are there things that local governments can do? Are there things that courts can do beyond what we're looking at right now? General, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's really a tough question to answer, and which is why we're having these court battles now. Certainly, Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson in Chicago have done everything they can to slow this process down and stop this process, and so far have been successful in the courts. And it seems as though the courts are the last bulwark of our democracy in putting a stop to this. And now it remains to be seen how the administration will respond to these court orders, and what the Supreme Court will do once it eventually gets there.
What about you? What do you think about this?
So I'm thinking about what state and local officials can do. And legally, there's really no way they can stop the president from calling the National Guard into federal service. So if they were to deploy the Guard themselves, that wouldn't, as a legal matter, stop the president from calling them up. So it's not so much a legal thing that I'm talking about here, but I do think that there are things that can be done, and they fall into the categories of prevent, respond, and monitor. And in terms of prevention, I think something that is very important is for state and local officials to have open lines of communication with activist groups and other local organizations that are involved in protest activity, that are planning protest activity, to make sure that those relationships are in place, and make sure that local law enforcement understands the importance of de-escalation in these contexts. All of this is to make sure that there isn't a ready pretext or excuse for the president to federalize the Guard or to deploy troops. In terms of responding, when there are unlawful actions, instances of violence, this has absolutely been happening, that state and local law enforcement have been responding to those, and they can do that without violating some of their own ordinances and laws that prevent cooperation or prevent assistance to ICE, right? Because in a lot of these jurisdictions, they're not able to provide assistance. But there is a definite distinction between providing assistance to ICE and arresting somebody who is involved in vandalizing property or throwing rocks or something like that. So, or if that's appropriate, if an arrest is appropriate under the circumstance. So responding to those incidents. And then finally, I would say monitoring what is happening, the actions that they are seeing from ICE and other federal agents, recording when they get requests for assistance versus when they don't, because a lot of what has come down to in the courts, or what it has come down to, is looking at these different declarations. And a lot of times it was the declarations of local and state law enforcement that were more complete, more credible, and more reliable in terms of getting a picture of what was actually happening and allowing the district court to come to the conclusion that there was no need to deploy the military.
And we're sitting here having this conversation, the two of us, in New York City. And New York is girding to be next because with the mayoral election, the president has said, I'm going to take over New York, and the new mayor is a communist, and many of these other things. New York heretofore has not really had some of these issues the way Chicago, the way Portland, the way Los Angeles have. The media has reported that Governor Hochul has been convening civil groups and government agencies, getting people aligned on how to keep orderly protest, how the government can respond. What do police departments need to worry about? It seems like a potential risk of clashes because you have different groups of legitimate military forces or legitimate armed forces on the streets of these cities. Right. Have there been clashes up until now?
There have been real issues with communication that you see in some of these declarations between local law enforcement and some of the federal agents who are on the ground. And that has made things very difficult for local law enforcement, both to provide the assistance they're being asked to provide, but also to keep people safe. But you do see in situations where the effort is really made to make sure that those lines of communication are open and are working well, things tend to go much better. And I really think that this is a matter of sort of reinforcing the training that these officers already have in working with federal counterparts, but also de-escalation, working with community groups, working with faith leaders, working with other representatives of the community to try to make sure that these protests go smoothly.
And it was noted that Jessica Tisch, the current New York Police Commissioner, who Mayor-elect Mamdani has said he will try to keep on, said the other day that she had gotten an advance notice of an immigration raid on Canal Street that drew a lot of spontaneous protests, but it helped keep the calm to know in advance. Is there a tension between cities or areas, localities that consider themselves sanctuary cities that say they won't cooperate in some way with federal immigration enforcement? Does that create a vacuum for federal forces that wouldn't exist otherwise?
It shouldn't, because if people are involved in criminal activity during a protest, and again, this has been very, very rare, but it has happened, right? And when that happens, these people are violating normal local laws. And the fact they're doing it outside of an ICE facility really should make no difference. Now, I think they're in situations where people have blocked ICE vehicles from coming in and out of detention centers. In general, that's been left to federal agents to clear the driveway so the cars can come in and out. They've had no problem doing that. Mm-hmm. That's a snap for FPS officials and for ICE officials to clear a driveway. We don't need the military to clear a driveway. Mm-hmm. So the sort of division of labor between what the federal agents are doing and what local authorities can do and should do is fairly clear, and there is no vacuum there that needs to be filled by the military.
General, you talked about the laws that need to be fixed. And one of the things we are doing at the Brennan Center, and a lot of people are doing, even as we're in the middle of all these big immediate battles and fights and crises, is to try to envision what could come next. How do you make a case to the people who are running for president, the people who serve in Congress, that dealing with these issues, reforming the Insurrection Act, as you said, and other things, really needs to be a priority, even though it's not a, quote, kitchen table issue?
Well, I probably should defer to Lisa on a lot of that. But I think, from my perspective, one of the biggest problems we have with the way the Trump administration is handling this is that there has been a breach. There's been an unspoken agreement in this country that the military will not get involved in politics, and in exchange for that, the politicians will not politicize the military. And unfortunately, what we're seeing happen today is an increased politicization of the military, whether you're talking about bringing the National Guard into these cities, or probably more concerning, really, or just as concerning, are all the firings of these generals and admirals. And, within a couple of weeks of taking over the Pentagon, taking over the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth has fired all three of the top JAGs. These are career lawyers, career military lawyers who have reached the pinnacle of success as a military lawyer, and are duty bound to give unfettered advice to their commanders. Why in the world would you start firing not just one, but every one of those top JAG officers? And we've seen the same thing happen where they have fired particularly female 4-stars. There is some kind of agenda going on here where they're going to be where they will be replacing these very senior flag officers with folks who may be more amenable to their concerns. So I think we may well need to institutionalize that relationship between the civilian authorities and the military, because our country is formed on civilian control of the military, and we've honored that throughout the breach, and that's one of the reasons we have the problems we're having right now today. But by the same token, it's honored because we don't politicize the military, and I'm afraid that is rapidly going by the wayside.
And the professionalization of the military, the restoration of trust between the military and civilian populations, that was hard earned. By the end of the Vietnam War, trust had completely collapsed, and both the professionalization of the military, the really upgrading of the people who were serving in the military, the introduction of legal authorities within the military to ensure that when we're doing military action overseas, that the rules of law are being followed. This has been a huge source of strength for the country, and it didn't just happen. It happened because it was needed after Vietnam and built over many decades. And Pete Hegseth can strut around all he wants and talk about war fighting, but there's a reason why we have it this way, and this is something that's going to have to be painstakingly reinforced and rebuilt. I will ask a final question of each of you that our audience wants to know. What should folks listening and watching take away?
Yeah. I think the most important thing to take away from this is that this is not normal. This is not how we do things in this country. We don't use the military. We don't have presidents using the military as a domestic police force to engage in routine law enforcement. That is a dramatic departure from historical precedent and from our norms and values. And it comes with very significant risks to our democracy, to individual liberties, and to public safety.
Thank you, Liza Goitein. General.
Well, I agree with everything that Liza said. And I think what terribly disturbs me, and I think what should concern every citizen, is that the Trump administration is seeking to destroy institution after institution after institution. Whether it's NATO, or whether it's the military, whether it's the Federal Reserve, the State Department, they're going in and taking wrecking balls to these institutions that have served us well and that have been developed in some cases over centuries, but certainly over decades. And that's concerning not only to this country, but concerning to our allies. And I know that I've spoken to several folks who are very, very concerned about what Trump is doing to NATO, and that these institutions are there for a reason. They're in his attacks on the guardrails that try to restrain presidential power are nothing short of appalling. So clearly, we need to, frankly, if you read any of Project 2025, and I didn't read all of it, but I can tell you that I read everything on veterans in that document, and it's appalling what those people want to do. They don't want to take us back the 1980s. They don't want to take us back to the 1950s. They want to take us back to the 1880s, where it's government by oligarchy and not by democracy.
Well, thank you. And thank you both. Thank you to Liza Goitein of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. And thank you, retired General William Enyart, for your service and your wisdom here today. These issues matter a lot. It really goes to the heart of our democracy and what kind of country we want to live in, and whether we as a people want to walk the streets proudly in freedom or in fear. The stakes really are that high. We will be continuing to have conversations on this and all the other issues facing our Constitution in weeks to come. If you have found this useful, please help us out by subscribing, by letting people know. You can find this on YouTube, on Spotify, and all the other places where you get podcasts. And take care, and thanks for joining us.